I've been playing a lot of shooters recently, and I've been noticing a lot of changes as to how they've been ending. They used to just end with massive boss fights, but now tend to end more often with a quick time event. I wanted to make this video to address what kind of endings are often in shooters, why they've been changing, and some ideas on what that means for narratives. The classic way that shooters have been ending as far back as the original Wolfenstein is a big boss fight. You face a big enemy, and all of the skills you've been learning throughout playing the game are put to a test. Eventually, after some struggle, you're able to finally beat the boss, usually by the skin of your teeth, and after the boss has gone through various forms. Narrative-wise, this is rather effective because you would have a big evil guy who would be the cause of your problems throughout the game, and killing them would be a clear resolution of the story. The various forms of a boss would allow each different form to be a testing of a different skill that was acquired during the game. As an example, though not quite a third-person shooter, Mass Effect had the first phase of the final boss be based off of a conversation, and your ability to use the conversation wheel would allow the boss to kill himself in the first phase. This has become less popular in recent times because in modern shooters there tends to be no justification as to why a single person can shrug off wave after wave of bullets, as well as the fact that in modern shooters villains tend to have similar guns to you. So instead of patterns that can be learned or dodged like an imp throwing fireballs, the player is forced to take damage because they are shot with a hit scan gun. This is why people can often complain about final bosses being too video gamey when in fact they are just poorly executed. Another reason that boss fights are losing popularity is because the amount of effort put into a boss that is encountered once could be used to put a new enemy type that's faced throughout the rest of the game. As an example, if you were a developer for Halo Combat Evolved, would you rather have a single final boss or have hunters developed so that way you would be able to scatter them throughout any mission or any map? The non-combat ending tends to be more reserved for Metroid games, but it still works in the shooter format. It is a type of ending that focuses less on combat skills and more on the player trying to escape at the end. This tended to work fairly well within the Halo franchise as they gave the player a sense of anxiety as it wasn't a fight against a health bar but a ticking clock, and instead of shooting a massive glowing target, they'd have to avoid getting flipped or slowed down. This actually accomplishes a few things. It can remind the player the sense of scale of what they've actually done, and allow developers to cheat by reusing older map assets as the player tries to race through them. The player is usually too busy rushing through to notice that they've been through this area before. This allows an introduction of an older character or characters that can sacrifice themselves in such a way that would not usually work in other ending types. Narrative-wise, this usually ends the story on more of a downer note as the player was unable to stop the destruction, even if they caused it, and is only able to make it to safety at the end through the skin of their teeth as well as the sacrifice of others. The problem with this type of ending is that when it's focused more on a skill that players don't actually enjoy, it can be very frustrating, and the developers may not always realize what aspects of the game the players find the most fun. This type of ending can be quite satisfying as the player can usually have a lot of difficulty facing enemies and having to conserve resources throughout the entire game, be it ammo or mana, and then suddenly having an unlimited source of power or an extremely powerful weapon to play with as they head into the final act. This can be super satisfying to a point. The idea of a universal answer to whatever enemies throw at you can be stress relieving, especially with difficult games, but can also become quite boring if it goes on far too long. This is why it can be followed up with a boss fight that is still challenging even with infinite resources. Narrative-wise, this tends to play on the idea of the heroic journey and giving the player a mastery of their skills, especially if it references the start of the game to show how much the player has grown and advanced. It also shows how much the stakes have escalated through the mechanics of the game rather than just telling the player that the world will now end or some other abstract idea. This ending is becoming more popular even in games that aren't generic military shooters, as it gives everyone a more consistent ending. It doesn't require particular skill from the player and acts like an ending cinematic, but is perceived to be more enjoyable since the player is interacting with it in some way. Instead of locking some players out from a skill test at the end of the game, it requires them to do timed button presses, which lets more of the players finish the game. It also takes a lot less resources to develop, though it ends up being less engaging to most players. This allows you to have human antagonists who don't act like bullet sponges and have a more cinematic ending, but this tends to make it less interesting as you aren't doing anything cool, but the character on the screen is. In the sense of the narrative, this can be used to accomplish really whatever the developer wants, because it's a cutscene, and despite being a cutscene, it can still be messed up. Ace Combat Assault Horizon was infamous for not having anything happen if you fail a QTE. The Order 1886 was infamous for replacing most of the gameplay with its QTEs.